think I forgot to mention, but if you look at our modules, there's kind of a nice organization system to the class. So we finished our foundations, which is just the intro to what psychology is, a little bit about how we do research, and now we're into our second big module, which is how our brains and bodies work. So we're starting today actually talking more about the brain. Next week we're going to talk about sensation and perception involving the brain, also our bodies, and continue on there. Okay. Good. Any questions about the class? What we're doing? Are you ready to learn about the brain today? It's a big part of psychology. We just finished talking about genetics, so that gave us a little overview of all the interactions that are happening between our genes, between the genes and the environment. Also remember that we ourselves play a role in that, so we're an individual agent that also has a role in our development. Okay. So today we're going to talk about the nervous system, and we'll primarily be focused on the central nervous system, but we will also talk about the peripheral nervous system. So you're going to get today a lot of diagrams that are showing you all the different parts of the nervous system, how it's all connected. Okay, so basically we'll be talking a lot about neurons, which are specialized cells. We usually talk about them in terms of brain cells. So how our neurons are communicating with one another, within the brain, through the spinal column, into all other parts of our body. All right. And the heart of this is electrochemical impulses and stimulation. Okay. So at the very broadest level, we have our human nervous system at the top, and we have two main differentiations. We have the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. We're going to think, when you think about peripheral nervous system, think of nerves. So complex system of nerves that are traveling basically everywhere throughout our body. When we say central nervous system or CNS, that's talking specifically about the brain and the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is actually the mediator, so it connects the brain to all of these nerve networks. Okay. And we'll talk a lot about how the central nervous system is in terms of processing sensory information. That's where all the information is processed, and then our brains can tell our bodies to do various things, right? And there's bidirectional processes going on. All right. So we are going to now talk more about the central nervous system. Again, primarily the brain and the spinal cord. And starting off with a question, you might have heard this. Do we only as humans use about 10% of our brain? Has anyone heard this before? Know anything about it? What have you heard about it? I saw you shaking your head. Yeah.
I've heard people say that, but I don't think it's true.
Okay, so you're like, nah, I don't think that's true. Yeah, it's one of our myths that we have in psychology. It's been perpetuated in media, different movies, just a general idea. Okay. So basically we use almost all parts of our brain all the time. Even when we're sleeping, our brain is incredibly active. We wouldn't be able to function the way we do if we weren't using almost all of our brain. So we definitely don't use 10%. A little bit of history about how our brain as humans evolved. And one cool thing is to compare us to Neanderthals who, were in existence around the same time as us, modern anatomical humans. But their brains were actually very different. Actually, there was some crossbreeding going on around the same time too. So some humans have a very small percentage of Neanderthal genes in them. But going back to their brain, so if you look at Neanderthal brains, they are larger than human brains, and their shape is different. So they're more elongated like a football, and there are different proportions of white and gray matter, which have to do with fatty substances and genetic material in the brain. And the reason why their brains are this way, well, they were adapted to serve specific functions. So basically, their brains have more dedicated space to sensations. So looking around them, making sure that they're visually processing information, they're auditorily processing information. And why is that? Because they relied much more on kind of their predatory side than we did as humans. So that was a really important part of their survival. For humans, our brain is smaller, it's more round. And the reason why we see that over time, it has a lot more folds also, so that allowed for more surface area. But it's because we have more social brains than Neanderthals did. And being a part of a group, helping each other survive, adapting to our environment, that was all incredibly important for our survival over time. So millions and millions of years led to these specialized brains that we have that serve different purposes. Okay. So we are social beings. It'll come up throughout the class, but basically, like without social interaction, like especially when we're very young, like we could die. We could just not survive without that. It's so incredibly important to us as humans. Okay. All right. Anyone want to say anything else about how humans have evolved? Information you'd like to share? Glad you said that, because it is more than being fed. Like as humans, we require more than that. So that human interaction is essential, literally, to our development. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. There are really sad cases throughout history where there has been extreme neglect, and you can see it, how it affects development, their physical development. So you might have a baby, an infant that's 7 months, but they seem like they're 2 or 3 months just based on their size, because they're not growing and developing as they should. They're not usually smiling like we think of with infants. They have a blank stare. Their brain is rapidly declining. Yeah. All right, thanks for that. Cool. So, a lot of new terms. We will spend time defining most of the things up here. You'll notice there's not definitions yet. But now we're just trying to kind of orient to different areas of the brain. There's a lot of different ways to organize the brain. So here's one way, and then we'll look at different ways. In this particular organization scheme, we're looking at the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The forebrain is this largest area right here, the pink area with all of those intricate folds, right? That compose our frontal lobe, as we'll see, or also known as the cerebral cortex area. Has things like the thalamus and hypothalamus. How many of you have heard of that? Maybe like in terms of medical stuff. All right, we'll talk more about it. Pituitary gland, we know, is important for hormone secretion. Limbic system, our reward system. So there's a lot going on in the forebrain. We typically think of it as our conscious control center, right? So it helps us do the very complex things we do as humans, like plan, organize. It's like the CEO of our brain. Okay, so the midbrain, we have this little area, it's a much smaller area. It's composed of many different structures, things like the reticular formation. We'll see that's important in like sleep-wake cycles. The substantia substantia nigra, the VTA, ventral tegmental area. Those are really important in rewards and motivation for us as humans. And then we have the hindbrain, kind of this general region, but you can kind of think of it as this back part of your brain here. Some important structures are the medulla, the pons, the cerebellum, which has to do a lot with movement. Collectively, it's mostly our brainstem. Okay. So the way our brain has evolved over time is the same way that it starts off as a human, which is kind of interesting, right? So you might hear the hindbrain called like our reptilian brain, right? Because it regulates all of our basic body functions that we could not survive without. And then over time with evolution, as we developed a more social brain, that was much more the forebrain area. And even when we're in utero, when we are after conception and development is happening, it starts with the hindbrain and it ends with the cerebral cortex, the forebrain. Yep. Okay. All right, so we're gonna go more into part of the forebrain. This is again the cerebral cortex, but now we're gonna divide it into different lobes of the brain. There are 4 different lobes. Again, it's some of the most complex stuff that we do as humans. And even though it looks really simplified, like this area does this, in reality, all parts of the brain are working together and often many things are responsible for one behavior or action. So it's not as simple as it seems, but let's just divide it into 4 lobes. Okay, so we have in the back here, you can think of it as your eye all the way to the back of your brain. That's our occipital lobe. That has to do with vision, so processing visual information. Maybe that's an easy way for you to think about it. The eye, straight back, occipital lobe. Okay, our visual cortex. This lobe that's kind of by our ear, like right here, that is responsible for our auditory cortex, so sound and hearing, as well as other things. So it also has to do with smell. You can think about our nose and ear both being close to this lobe of the brain, and also language comprehension. So that's also known as Wernicke's area. Only comprehension. What does comprehension mean? Comprehending language. What does it mean?
Understanding, processing it.
Yeah, understanding language. So someone's talking to you and you're understanding what they say. One important part of language, but it's not producing language, which is really interesting. That's in a different part of the brain. Okay. All right. So this tan looking one right here, this is the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is primarily responsible for touch and other sensations and taste. Okay. And then last we have our frontal lobe, the very front here by our forehead. And that is the CEO center where all of that higher order processing and thinking happens. Okay. We also have a lot of motor control. We'll have a whole motor strip, we'll see about it. And then the language production, as I mentioned, Broca's area is located in that frontal lobe. Okay. So you can imagine if you have damage to one area of your brain, let's say in the frontal lobe, it might affect the way that you can communicate through speech, but you may still be able to understand something, right, in terms of comprehension, because that's in a different lobe, if that lobe wasn't damaged. It can lead to something called locked-in syndrome. Heard about that? Yeah, unfortunately, maybe some damage to the brain, an accident, or something else happening where you're totally understanding everything that's happening to you, but you can't respond either like verbally or with your body in any way. Maybe just an eye blink to indicate that you're hearing what someone is saying or you're able to understand it. Okay, so different brain areas, different functions, do different things. All right, so we will have some practice in seminar about identifying the different lobes of the brain. Okay, so those were the 4 big lobes. This image kind of shows some more specific areas within those lobes. So the lobes are still in different colors for the most part, but researchers have identified even more specific areas, like the Broca's area will specifically be in this area of the frontal lobe, right? Alright, so you can just take a look at that for a second. You'll notice that language and reading has these like dotted lines around it. That's because there's not like one specific area, but a number of different things that are working together. It's a whole system. Yeah, so there's not just one area that deals with language in our brains. The way we evolved, it's using multiple areas. Okay. All right. Ready for a practice question? Ready or not? Okay. So let's think about, I'm going to read you some activities or some examples here, and you're going to tell me which lobe would primarily be responsible for processing this information. Okay. A is realizing that the delicious smelling bread you're baking is nearly done. Okay. So think about what sense you might be using there, what lobe of the brain is associated with that. You can talk to your neighbor to confirm. I can't remember if I have them. I might have to update this so I can give you the answer. And I'll go back. Okay. We have a little recognition. Okay. All right, on the count of 3, you'll say it out loud. 1, 2, 3. Temporal lobe. Good. So that's green one right here. Sense of smell, right? Good. B is understanding that the buttons and digital display in your car, they go together in a way that controls the radio. Take a second to think about it. Anyone have a guess? Maybe this one's a little harder. What do you think? Frontal lobe? I could see how you think it'd be the frontal lobe. There's a better example of the frontal lobe. So, any other? Yeah. Yeah. So this is the best one of the occipital lobe. And again, I know it's overlapping, but the fact that you're looking at something and trying to understand its different parts and putting it together to make sense, we would use the occipital lobe for that vision component. Yes. Okay. C is buying refreshments and decorating your house for an upcoming party. Here's where the frontal lobe would be the better example for it. Yes, so you're having to do some complex mental gymnastics and arithmetic, maybe to plan how much stuff to buy, how many people are coming, what you want the theme to be, right? All of that would be part of your frontal lobe. And then the last one then, feeling pain when someone pinches you. The only one that's left is the parietal lobe. Okay. All right. We'll get lots more practice. Here is an example of multiple brain areas working together, and that is to coordinate and regulate movement. Okay, so I'm just going to point out some different areas in our brain. The first one is called our little brain, or cerebellum. You can see just like visually it kind of looks like with all the folds, and it kind of looks like a little version of our brain. So again, that's part of our kind of lower level brain areas. Has to do with muscle coordination, balance, you're able to walk in a straight line, you're not falling over, the timing of movement when you're grasping for an object, something like that. The basal ganglia, which is here, right in the middle here, right, also has to do with movement, but in a different way. Specifically, we're talking about intentional movement, so we're making an effort. Right? We want to do something in a certain way. and the motivation for wanting to do that in the first place. And then we have the primary motor cortex. That is this area right here. We're going to talk about it more in the next slide. It is part of the parietal lobe. So that was the example, right? The feeling pain when someone pinches you, parietal lobe. Okay. You can see even though the primary motor cortex is here, there's an area next to it that is all supplementary in terms of motor as well. So lots of areas of the brain help us with motor control and movement. As well as neurotransmitters. We haven't got to that yet. Those are chemical messengers that also help us with movement. Too much or too little can lead to difficulties. All right, so let's hear more about that motor strip. Again, it's this kind of area going down the parietal lobe of our brain. It is highly specialized, so it's literally different parts of the strip have to do with different areas on our body. And you can see that the sensitivity refers to how much space is dedicated on that motor strip. Okay, so things that need a lot of precise movements to carry out, like speaking, right, have a big part here, like lips, right? When you're talking, using your tongue also to talk, right? You have to make these very precise movements, so there's a lot of space dedicated to it. What's the other thing that we see a lot of space given to for motor control? Yeah, so you'll see that yellow part, it's like digit 2, 3, 4, 5, what does that mean? That's our fingers, right? And our wrists and our hands. So that's the other large area where we have very precise motor control, right? We can pick up a bead that's very, very tiny. Okay, cool. Okay, so that is our motor strip. I'm just realizing I did say the wrong thing, didn't I? Did I say this was part of the parietal lobe? I think I might have. So the motor, if I did, I'm sorry. The motor strip is part of the frontal lobe. The sensory strip is part of the parietal lobe. They are right next to each other, side by side, but one is in one lobe, the other is in another lobe. So I might have jumped the gun on that one. Okay. So the primary motor cortex is in the frontal lobe. So what that means is when we want parts of our body to do things, right, that is part of our frontal lobe, giving those messages to our body to produce the actions that we'd like them to, intentional movement. Okay. There's this one. I like this image because it shows that they are right side by side, right? So the sensory strip on the parietal lobe side, the motor strip on the frontal lobe side. All right. Sorry if I messed that up. So the sensory strip, we have something very similar going on, right? We have a strip of our brain, and again, it's highly specialized. So there are different areas corresponding to different areas of our body. It's demonstrated a little bit differently, right? But this is how sensitive some parts of our body are, okay? The size, again, it matters. So you can see some of the most sensitive things for us are, again, like our lips, our thumbs in particular, looking at the tips, right? Our fingertips, very sensitive, and so on. Has anyone heard of a homunculus before? Yeah. Okay. So what it is it's looking at if what we did was actually put this into the size of what it should be, like based on sensitivity or based on motor control, what would we look like as humans? Okay. So this is the one for sensory, right? Like how sensitive different parts of our body are, corresponds to what we just talked about. And then this is the motor version. So you can see for both, right, there's a lot of sensitivity and motor control of our hands and our mouth areas. A little bit of difference in the body, you can see, like in terms of the legs, much more like muscly looking right on the sensory side. All right. They're funky looking. The motor one doesn't have any ears, you'll notice, because are you in control of moving your ears? Really great. Not like other animals, maybe. Okay. Okie dokie. Let's keep going here. So, you just talked about all the complex things that regulate movement. Another important system in our brain is called the limbic system. This one, again, lots of different areas coming together to influence things like our motivation, our emotion, learning, memory. So I'm just going to point out a few important areas that are part of the limbic system. Okay. So you have the hypothalamus, which is around here. Very important for regulating some of our most important body cycles, eating and drinking, heavily involved in the endocrine system, the hormone system of our body, as well as the pituitary, so these are very closely related. The amygdala, if you hear the word amygdala, think about emotions, so that's an important emotion processing center in our brain, things like fear. And then whenever you hear hippocampus, you should think about memory. So it's an area of our brain that's really important in all stages of memory. Okay, cool. All right, so that's the limbic system. You already aren't familiar with it. Okay. Kind of an overview of the brain. Next, we're going to talk about different hemispheres of the brain, specializations that are happening. Okay. Have you heard before, like, oh, I'm more right-brained, or I'm more left-brained? Maybe you've heard people say that. Similar to the 10%, like, this is kind of a myth. So we use both hemispheres of our brain all the time. Both hemispheres talk to each other. We wouldn't be able to function without that communication. It would be very different for us as humans. So you're not one brain or the other. You use both, but the hemispheres are specialized. So yeah, what do you want to say?
Is it true that you can be fully functional without a part of your brain? Like I've seen kind of
Yes.
from medical.
There have been people who have been born with only half of their brain, like one hemisphere, and you can be functional. And there have been people who have had their hemisphere removed. It's called a hemispherectomy. Like if you have severe seizures in one hemisphere, they can remove it. And it's because of brain plasticity, you can still typically function pretty well, especially if it happened when you were a child, because there's more plasticity when you're a child. Yeah, so one example of a young girl who had a hemispherectomy at 6, when she woke up, she was paralyzed, she wasn't able to speak, but with intensive physical therapy and working with linguists and speech pathologists and all these people, you couldn't even tell what she went through by the time she was an adolescent. She's doing archery, she went to college, I think she's graduated by now. So it's pretty amazing that parts of our brain, if they're dead or they're not there, other parts can go in, create new connections and fill in basically.
Would that depend on what age, what part of the brain removed?
Yeah, it's what age you got it removed, is that what you said?
Yeah, for younger kids that have a better chance.
You have a much better chance if you're younger in terms of full functioning to what it was before. There's always plasticity though. So even when you're older, there's room for growth and improvement. So when people are older and they have a stroke, for example, right? If they're working really intensely, rehabilitation, all of that, there might be some lingering effects, but they might be able to regain their speech or something like that. Yeah. Actually, I have a really good example on the next slide. Okay, so before I get into that example, that specialization does occur in different brain lobes. So our left brain, or the left hemisphere, is not completely responsible for language, but a lot of stuff related to language is in that hemisphere. So we call it the language hemisphere. And then the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. So it's kind of the opposite of what you would expect. And our right brain has a lot to do with our visual processing. So that's kind of where the myth comes from. Although, again, it's not as straightforward and separated as it seems. And the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. Okay. So this happened, the example I'm going to give you some time ago, but unfortunately, former Congresswoman Gabrielle Gifford was, kind of graphic, but was shot, and it's a really interesting case of like where she was shot and how it affected her functioning and what happened after that. So this is kind of a detailed diagram of like how the bullet entered and exited her head, her brain. And what happened was it hit the back of her head, and then it only went through one hemisphere, okay? And it exited through this side here, right by her eye, her left eyebrow. Okay. So it was in the left hemisphere. Again, we know that there's some specialization. So we know that the speech function, especially the ability to understand speech and speak, would be impacted. And that's what happened, right? So after all the procedures, when she woke up, she was unable to speak. So there was intense therapy, right, like working on it, and eventually she regained the ability to speak. But what was really interesting is since her right hemisphere was not impacted, they did things like use music to actually help her regain her skills, her language skills. So that can be processed more in the right hemisphere, and she was able to kind of use her abilities that she still had in the right hemisphere to help her regain the abilities more in the left hemisphere. So really interesting how that specialization happens. Okay. And what your question was just asking about brain plasticity, yeah, I just want to reinforce that our brains are plastic. They can rewire themselves to compensate for damage, whatever kind of damage that is. And there's even cases where the corpus callosum, which is the structure that connects the right and left brain hemisphere, that can be severed for various reasons, accidental or actual procedure, like a medical procedure. And there's still ways that we can function as a human being. Maybe some things will be very difficult for us forever, but it's not a death sentence, essentially. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's always related back to brain plasticity, but especially I think with that is like where the damage happened. So with Phineas Gage, it was the frontal lobe, specifically like areas to do with your personality. So it seemed like he was a different person because that's where the damage was, and then maybe other aspects of himself, like his motor control and movement, everything else seemed just fine or the same. So it can't, based on where it is, it can have very different effects on people. Yeah, we'll talk about some more famous cases that have led to memory issues in particular, like not being able to form new memories or not remembering old memories, and differences just based on where it happens. Okay, good. Thank you for that. All right. Okay, so last thing before we get to neurons is the brain stem. So the brain stem, remember that's primarily part of the hindbrain. So here we're looking at how our brain conveys information to other parts of our body. through the spinal cord, right? It's an important part of it. But what happens in the brainstem is largely things beyond our control that keep us alive. So we're not thinking about breathing. We're not thinking about the pressure in our body, right? Like making sure that happens. It just happens automatically. Not saying we can't control things like heart rate, because we actually can as humans, but a lot of these processes are happening beyond our conscious awareness, and they are automatically happening. So they're sustaining our life. Really important. Okay. Alrighty. Any questions about what we've just gone over in terms of an introduction to different parts of the brain, different hemispheres? Okay. All right. Well, let's get into neurons. So neurons, again, they're specialized nerve cells. We think about them a lot in the brain. There are also cells that are non-neuronal. These are called glial cells, and they basically support or help out our neural cells. So they're working together, all in our nervous system, and they allow our brain to communicate across our bodies. Okay, we're going to go over the structure of a neuron. So I have an image in the next slide that's much more detailed, but here's just the structures, right? So we have our cell body, or the soma. That's similar to kind of like what you would imagine as a nucleus, like the center. Okay, nucleus with chromosomes. The dendrites you can think of as like branches, like tree branches. They are receiving information from other surrounding neurons. And then we have an axon, which is basically the tail. So this is where the action potential happens, right? This is where like the electrochemical signal is actually passed through, and that allows us to transmit messages through different neurons. Okay. So different ways we can think about neurons: sensory neurons in terms of our senses, motor neurons looking at specifically going to muscles and glands, and then there are interneurons. Inter means like within each other. The neurons are communicating with one another. Call that neurotransmission. Okay. All right, so here's what, this is actually two neurons, what communication would look like. Okay, so here's our soma, right in the middle, little ball area, nucleus in the center there. The dendrites are all of these branching out, right? So they're looking to get information from other people. And then this area right here, that's our axon, or the tail. You'll notice that there are these little, they're actually fatty substances. They're white. They're called myelin sheets. There's like little spaces in between each one. So what happens is, because they're fatty, they allow the message to be conducted very efficiently, so very quickly. And the message kind of jumps in between these roads of Ranvier in a very, very fast way. So it happens like instantaneously almost. Okay, goes down the length of that tail, gives the message to the next neuron, right? And here you'll notice something called a synapse. That is the gap between the neurons, right? So they're not actually touching, but there's electrochemical information being passed on in that gap that the next neuron picks up, right? And uses that to say, okay, now we're gonna continue to send the message, or maybe now we're gonna stop something, whatever that message is. All right, how many people, this sounds familiar? Like, I remember this, maybe? Okay. Maybe not. So either way. Okay. How many neurons do you think we have? We have billions. Yeah, we actually were born with more neurons than we need. So a lot of them die. Like a lot of them, we are dead. We get rid of them. We can create new ones over time, neurogenesis. Oh my gosh, hold on. I like need to see your mouth moving. Is it true that
like structures or like neurons themselves, like in your stomach as well as your brain?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, so you're thinking of like
Yeah.
our gut.
Yeah, because like I read that the place in your body that has the most neurons is where your brain stuff. It's
Mhm.
actually your stomach, which is so
Mhm.
weird because I would think it would be like your hands or something.
Yeah, it's so that, and that refers to kind of the gut-brain connection. Yeah, so people have actually said, yeah, our stomachs are kind of like another little brain, like not in any very serious way, but in the way that they do have this important like processing that's happening that is similar. Yeah, it's really fascinating. It's a pretty new area in psychology. I don't know about other fields, but we're learning more and more about it every day. Okay. All right, so again, there's potential messages that can be passing on in different neurons. So what's actually happening? How do the messages get sent forward? Well, again, in that axon, for the message to be transmitted through that axon, right, we have to pass a certain threshold. We have to get to this all or none principle, where enough neurotransmitters, right, or other signals are accumulating. So you're moving from a resting potential, getting more and more excitatory, reaching this action potential, right? And at that point, the message is sent forward to the next one. Okay, so it has to reach a certain point to send the message. Then it recovers back here. There's sodium and potassium involved in sharing, right, with all those messages. We'll talk a little bit more about it in seminar. Also, of course, your book is a really good resource for fine details. All right, so just a little bit more about how messages are transmitted. We already talked about the synapse, that little gap there between different neurons. Okay, mentioned they do not touch, but it's that space, right? And what happens in that space, again, is where neurotransmitters can accumulate. So they hang out in that synapse, they're reabsorbed back into the original neuron after they send their messages, right? Neurotransmitters are chemical signals. There are a number of different neurotransmitters. You're probably familiar with some of these names. So they do different things for us. We can take drugs that mimic neurotransmitters so that they're sending messages that otherwise wouldn't have been sent by our brain that maybe are really important and we need. So things like dopamine and serotonin regulate our mood, our sleep. Acetylcholine has to do with muscle action and memory, actually really important in understanding Alzheimer's disease. And then endorphins are really important in pain and pleasure and how we're experiencing things. So these are all located in the synapse, right? Is where they would hang out, come into, come out of, to transmit that message. Okay. All right. But I think we can finish this section. Got 2 more slides here. All right, so more about message transmission. Here's that synapse, right? The dendrites, the synapse in the middle. Here's a zoomed in version of what it actually looks like. Okay, so we have vesicles here that contain the neurotransmitters, and when there's certain information, like an excitatory message, that tells them to release that into the synapse. Okay, so they're hanging out here. There are certain neurotransmitters that are excitatory. Those are glutamate, epinephrine, norepinephrine, so things like adrenaline, right? Because that's causing you to go into action, right? It's we also say like arousal, basically. Okay. There are other messages that are inhibitory. So while excitatory is like go, 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 inhibitory is like slow down or stop, right? So they block the signal from continuing on. Like we don't want the message transmitted anymore. And the best example of that is GABA, G-A-B-A, you might have heard of that one too in different like drugs, right? So gamma aminobutyric acid. All right, so different neurotransmitters doing different things. passing the message forward, stopping the message, pausing the message. Pretty complex. Okay, cannabinoid receptors, we have those as well. Okay, and then the last slide here, we'll stop for today, is just looking at different neuroimaging techniques we use in psychology, like how do we understand how the brain works? Well, we can sometimes see it working in real time. So that's particularly with the fMRI. That you're doing like a task in an fMRI machine, and you can see where the blood is flowing in different areas of your brain to show that it's active, and you're using that part of your brain to do that task. That's different from a regular MRI. That just can show you the structure, like what your structure of your brain looks like, different areas of it, but not in real time what you're doing. PET is another brain scan that we can do that also works with blood flow. And then you might have heard of an EEG at the top, the electroencephalogram or encephalography. Can't say that word. So here we're measuring the electrical activity in the brain. So it actually looks at like those action potentials that are happening and where they're happening in the brain. You have to be hooked up to different electrodes. It's an entire path that you put on your brain, and then it can see where the activity is. So pretty cool to see what's happening in your brain. Okay, I'll see you on Monday.